You were mocking me from being of average height. I can't control that. I can't control my genetics. That wasn't very... You were mocking me. I did not appreciate that.
Asking my followers if I should wear heels tonight, and I did not.
I never mocked on her appearance, and there's plenty of subject matter there, believe me, but I never did it. So I didn't appreciate that.
So today we are going to be debating the resolution, or we're going to be debating banning pornography. Specifically, the resolution is, should the U.S. government ban pornography? Now, the structured debate I'll go over very quickly, and then we'll jump right into it. We'll have opening statements from each of you guys, 10 minutes for John, then 10 minutes for Brianna, and then you guys will have a chance to rebuttal. It'll be 5 minutes for John, then 5 minutes for Brianna. And then after that, I will have 4 questions, 2 for each debater. There's going to be 1 for John to start with. You'll have 5 minutes to answer it, and then Brianna will have 3 minutes to respond to that. And then we'll go to Brianna for 5 minutes. John will have 3 minutes to respond to that. And then again, John for 5 minutes, Brianna for 3, Brianna for 5, John for 3. And then we'll conclude with a 30-minute Q&A where we will have a line right here where people can ask questions for both of you guys. So, and then 3 minutes each of concluding statements. So, let's start off with you, John. You'll have 10 minutes, give your opening remarks on whether the U.S. government should ban pornography.
Good evening. Can everybody hear me? All right? 11,000 people turned out this evening to see this tremendous debate. It's 11,000. You don't have to look around. I assure you that's there. We will eject you if you disagree. We will, at Uncensored America, we will censor you and eject you. We don't need you. We have 11,000 other people. But I would firstly like to thank the tremendous Uncensored America organization for putting this event together. They do a great job bringing back the tradition of American debates to the college campus, and I am sincerely honored to be a part of that. I'd also like to thank my opponent this evening, Brianna, for coming out to debate this topic. It's an important issue, a controversial issue. I think it'll be interesting, and I, of course, as well would like to thank the wonderful audience, the ladies and gentlemen, the very fine people who came out to watch the debate this evening. And the topic that we'll be dealing with is, of course, whether we should ban pornography. Ban, of course, being a very scary word, lots of very scary connotations to it. And my opponent will be arguing that we should not, and I will be taking the opposite position. When I first began speaking about this issue, I was much more focused on how pornography affects young men physiologically, what it does to their minds, to their spirits, and by extension, how that affects their state of being in the world as a whole and what their place is. But with all the arguments that could be made this evening on this issue on either side, I expect this is ultimately going to come down to what the role of government is, which is really to say, what actually is human nature? What do we tend to do? How do we tend to behave? And what conditions are most conducive to our flourishing? And due to these things that we know about us, when does it become necessary for the government to intervene? And the idea of the state or the government in the first place is something that exists to take into account these truths about human nature and create a framework that would allow for the general well-being of its people. And for centuries within Western civilization, specifically the Anglo-Saxon tradition, which inspired the foundation of our country, that understood perfectly well that most people, your average person, they're not going to be some hyper-rational, some hyper-vigilant agent, and therefore they will need some sort of entity to protect them from predation and exploitation at the hands of others, typically for handsome profit, which is exactly what we see nowadays. Moreover, the tradition which inspired and cultivated our framework of government was one rooted in Puritanism, which is now typically used as an insult by people in the camp of my opponent to say bland or uninteresting, to which we may counter with normal and not disgusting. But the point is that John Adams described our Constitution as being written for a moral and religious people, and that it would be, quote, wholly inadequate for any other group of people. This is to say that if our founding fathers heard the argument that the legal framework to which they bequeathed us was being used to justify the proliferation of the hardcore internet pornography that we see nowadays, they would have been appalled by this idea. And though modern activists enjoy obscuring it, our national tradition and our legal tradition are rooted in Christianity. Of course, the First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law establishing a state religion, which some misinterpret as a separation of church and state, but this is not exactly because they believed in freedom of religion, but rather because they were skeptical of the influence and authority of the Catholic Church It is what it is, and they wanted to make sure that their country would remain sovereign from the Vatican. This is not to say that all arguments against pornography have to be from the viewpoint of Christianity. This is all to say that if we can demonstrate that pornography is of significant harm to the American public, which it is, and that it is not constitutionally protected such that our government cannot take action against it, which it is not, then of course we can and should take action to rid it from society. And the reason that it's important to bring up Christianity is because the culture at the time of the founders, which they were all a part of, was Christian. And so to obscure the intentions or parameters of their legal framework for our country in service of justifying the nature of pornography and the way that it exists in society presently is just complete nonsense. If they're not here to speak for themselves because they've been dead for centuries, we can certainly get a general idea of what they have said and what they would have intended. And perhaps that's true, but how does that carry into the present day? It's a great question. To be honest, my work on this issue did not begin because of Christianity. It began because I was seeing what it was doing to the young men in this country, and by extension, how it was affecting families and society as a whole. To give you an idea of the effects of it, we should mention that 80% of men have viewed it in the last week. 50% of young men are viewing it every day now. The average age of exposure is 11 years old, meaning assuming a normal distribution, fully 50% of children are viewing it for the first time at ages younger than 11, and fully 22%, about a quarter, of all internet pornography viewed by minors is viewed by children younger than 10. All of these data points, with their trends taken into account, show that year by year, more people are watching it more often at a younger age, and it's an addiction because it does have effects, and nobody talks about it because it's embarrassing, but it is ultimately true, and it's been shown to rewire the neural pathways in your brain to make you addicted to it, to crave more of it, similarly to how the brains of drug addicts will show to have different neurochemical structures and pathways, especially within the reward circuitry portion of the brain, which may also be why, if you look at brain scans of drug addicts and pornography users, they show to be very similar in clinical evaluations. This is also why men who consume pornography experience feelings of depression, anxiety, lack of focus, brain fog, etc., because their dopamine receptors have been completely hijacked to compel them to place access to internet pornography as a priority. They're incapable of now experiencing pleasure the same way throughout their day-to-day lives, and that's going to affect their general state of being throughout the world. And so it is a slippery slope. You've got 50% of men saying that they're now interested in material that was once not interesting or even repulsive to them. You've got 20% of men saying that they have to actually use pornography while having sex with normal women to maintain arousal. That is not normal. That is the artificial supplementing you to be in that state. And there are lots of other problems, decreased gray matter in the brain, for example, that are caused by pornography. And of course, the younger you begin watching it, as the trends show is what is happening, that is when your brain is the most plastic and the most malleable. Therefore, the more damaging and irreversible effects are going to occur at that state of your life. And as you may know, I've put out a 2-hour-long video covering all the science behind this with hundreds of studies all cited, and you can go watch that if you want more information. But the bottom line, since I've only got 10 minutes, is that if the majority of divorces weren't citing pornography as a factor, if millions of young men in the world weren't reporting these systems, if children weren't being exposed to this content, like we said, at age 9 or 11 on average, if young people in this country weren't experiencing a cluster of anxieties and depression and feelings of isolation and inability to connect with other people, which is all directly linked to the widespread proliferation of pornography like we mentioned, perhaps I would feel differently. Honestly, I might even be sympathetic to the cries that we've seen, or unsympathetic rather, to the cries that we've seen from the religious right about this topic for the last several decades, since clearly the effects they warned about have been insignificant. Perhaps I'd even roll my eyes at them, but it's exactly the opposite. The opposite is what we're seeing because, we have a skeptical view of human nature naturally. And just how I think that the average person should have a right to go about their lives without having food waved in front of them that's going to make them sick and addicted and obese and poisoned, I likewise believe that people should be able to live their lives without being exposed to content that entices them into pursuing their own self-destruction. We have to ask ourselves, at what point do we understand that something is wrong, that we're headed in the wrong direction? Why would we not take action against that? Literally millions of American children and millions of young men are watching hardcore pornography every day, and they're harming themselves, but we're supposed to continue to allow that because that's why George Washington crossed the Delaware and froze at Valley Forge so that we could enshrine our God-given right to masturbate to videos of people having sex on the internet? That's ridiculous. That's absolutely nonsense. It compromises our men and it makes our families weaker, and the translation of that into society has been catastrophic. We are living in a sexually dysfunctional society. People are isolated, families are collapsing, people are not getting married, they're largely not even dating anymore, and these trends are completely new within our society, by the way. It'd be foolish to ignore the explosion and the proliferation of pornography in the last few decades or so, particularly the last 15 years or so, as a contributing and significant factor to this, because men are not going out into the world to meet women. They're instead being enticed by advertisements on the internet to stay alone and drain themselves of all their energy and all their ambition. Now, there are plenty of things that could be considered harmful to society that we would never ban, because there's a large benefit to them as well. Tens of thousands of people die every year from car accidents, but no one would think to ban cars because we understand there's a tremendous benefit to them. What tremendous benefit is there as a society that we are getting from unlimited, easy access to pornography that would outweigh and excuse all of the harm that we know that it does? Why is it ultimately good and worth it that children in elementary school are accessing this sexually depraved material? It's not like other things where you can more or less choose to consume it. It exists as an artificially created, carefully advertised version of what we are programmed to seek as men. The moment you view it, or in many cases just think about it or hear about it, you're no longer thinking clearly or rationally. That's why it's one thing if 20 years ago you go to an adult video store, you get a Playboy or something, but being able to access it now free of charge completely at any age, any variety, in any moment, it's completely different. Our brains are not wired to be able to handle that type of material. The things which our brains are wired to pursue most, food and sex, have now been corrupted and artificially synthesized to now the average American man is just this like fat porn-addicted slob. And this is not a healthy society, and we're perfectly capable of writing that trajectory. So in my experience, there are a few people who will try to make the case that pornography is actually good. They'll make the case maybe it's just not bad, it's neutral. But my opponent this evening is going to have to argue why it is a moral good for children to be able to access hardcore pornography at the click of a button, why it's good to provide unprecedented financial incentive to human traffickers and to sexual abusers, why it's good that young men are experiencing these symptoms of anxiety and depression because of their fried out dopamine receptors, why it's good that we are clicking our way down the path to total sexual dysfunction and depravity. The entire role of government, by definition, is to compel individual behavior to protect citizens from being harmed. Everything from a speed limit sign to homicide laws do this. Since it's acknowledged in all of our laws, why would it not draw the line at this? My opponent will have to argue why that line should not be drawn to protect children from being exposed to this material, protect women from having sexual abusers and human traffickers be paid for posting this material online, why families should not be protected from having their fathers and husbands enticed by this material, and why young boys should not be protected from warping their sexual habits and reward circuitry, making them impotent, anxious, and depressed, all so that pornographers and advertisers can make lots of money, and people such as my opponent get to continue to normalize their perversion and depravity upon society. It's a literally, $1 billion industry creating a sexually dysfunctional society. So I'm curious to hear why stopping that is worse than allowing it to continue. Thank you.
Right on 10 minutes. Brianna, you have 10 minutes.
So I didn't write out a speech. I wanted to do a conversation and debate tonight, so this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on me and why my view on this issue is a little bit more complicated than John's is. I want to talk about the areas where we disagree, and I want to talk about some of my concerns about the way that John has framed this. So, my career started actually with a lot of the way that a lot of y'all's did. I was a young, eager student. I wanted to go make a change in the world. Eventually, I launched a video game studio, and I started to find that I had certain ideas. I wanted to make change in the world. I wasn't really sure how to get out there and put that change in the world. I'm not going to rehash Gamergate, but I am going to say one of the things I did do is run for public office. And when you run for public office, especially something like United States Congress, the first thing you learn is all of these issues that John is trying to tell you are really simple, are actually a lot more complicated. Like, let's just look at the tenet of what we're talking about today. Should we ban porn? Let's think about that at a really high level. What is this going to involve? Well, the Democrats are going to spend about $1.4 billion in this election. I did a little bit of back-of-the-envelope math about how much it would cost to go do a constitutional convention and actually put a porn ban into the Constitution. I think a very lowball number on that would be us collectively coming together, 2/3 of the states ratifying this, and spending $20 billion having a conversation with ourselves about this. You start looking through jurisprudence. We think about issues like, should we ban pornography? And you start looking at things like the Miller test. You find out where it's banned, what is legal, and what the role is of states to be able to regulate things like this. And it's just so much more complicated than he wants to make it sound. So, John, this is where I want to start with it. I want to talk about some areas that we're probably going to agree on. one of the things I didn't like about the way the left responded to your videos is I think they mocked you. You know, several of my friends have made videos really mocking you and your point. And the part of your argument that I agree with is we do need to address this crisis that young men are facing. You're absolutely damned right about that. My own party has completely failed to seriously address this crisis that young men are facing. And I have to tell you, looking at some of these stats, it is absolutely terrifying. You know, men in their 20s, they are half as likely as women to be in relationships. The share of sexually active Americans right now is at a 30-year low. More than 60% of young men are single today. This is twice the rate of women. So you look at economic uncertainty as our economy has shifted to more of a knowledge economy, and whereas men used to be the primary breadwinners, today I see a lot of women that are competing in my favorite field, computer science, on a more and more equal playing field with men. And I think there are a lot of men out there that are asking themselves, what is my role in the world? What is my role in the economy? How can why am I feeling so lonely? Why am I reaching out to people and it's not working? This is a problem that we do need to take seriously. Where I think John is going really, really wrong is he's giving you extremely simple solutions to very complicated problems. One of the very first words you learn when you start to work in public policy is multifactorial. So if you ask yourselves, why are young men getting so addicted to pornography right now, which I agree with John, it is much worse than it used to be. We had a pandemic where people are not meeting each other face to face. His point about some of the stuff being far more available than it was for my generation, that's dead on. But we're also seeing, I was talking to some psychologists before this event started. We're talking about the crisis we're seeing with young people who do not have access to therapists. There's not enough of a supply. The rate of people out there that are dealing with anxiety, social disorders, we've never seen this before in American history. So, it's not as simple. We could go spend $20 billion and instead of addressing really serious problems, we could try to ban porn and hope that that helps young men. I don't think that that's the problem, though. Let me get real with all of y'all out there. I don't think there's a single young person in this crowd today that isn't keenly aware that Washington is not working for your generation. They're not interested in student debt. They're not interested in your path forward. They're not interested in helping you afford a house. They're not interested in getting you a living wage or health care. And I would posit to you that we need to channel that anger and that frustration that all of us feel into something more productive than a pie-in-the-sky argument about banning all pornography. I hope we can talk a little bit more about policy specifics because there are ways that don't involve a total ban of this that will help safeguard children. They will help men deal with pornography addiction. We do have common sense solutions for this, and I hope we can talk about it tonight. Thank you.
Okay, John, you have 5 minutes to do a rebuttal.
Well, I would first say, I guess, that while I appreciate the intent behind the conversation and debate, you asked all your Twitter followers and Reddit what your arguments should be. So I'm not even speaking to Brianna Wu. I'm speaking to like a trench coat filled with like all the Destiny subreddit people and all of those people. It's like a conglomerate of people who are not Brianna Wu. Moreover, I think that you are right. It is a complicated and nuanced issue. But that sort of tends to impede what we're trying to discuss, I think, because the resolution is, should we ban pornography? Not, would banning pornography be difficult? And I think that while maybe the particular policy components are nuanced and maybe difficult, the morality is quite clear. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on some of the more moral arguments that I laid out as opposed to the more politically based or policy arguments. But even that, I think, is largely overstated. I mean, you've had a lot of states, recently in the last few years take action to ban, I guess you would say, ID verify at the state level access to internet pornography, which has of course caused companies like MindGeek and Pornhub to freak out and say we're not going to allow you to access it in the state at all, which really kind of gives you some insight into the psychology of the average porn producer, right? Where they're like, oh, you're going to make it so minors can't view the content? Well, we're not going to do business with you anyways. And so it's like, okay, what really is the intent here behind a lot of this content? And also, I really don't think it's a complicated issue, honestly. I think that, we can debate about things, but ultimately it's like when you get a group of smart guys in those positions of power, near the levers of power, they can figure out how to do pretty much everything. I mean, this is the country that put a man on the moon or constructed a propaganda apparatus sophisticated enough to convince people it did. That seems to be significantly more difficult than just banning pornography, in my opinion. And it is true, a lot of your friends have made videos that were mocking me. I did not appreciate that. But I did see as well, you were mocking me from being of average height. I can't control that. I can't control my genetics. That wasn't you were mocking me. I did not appreciate that.
Asking my followers if I should wear heels tonight, and I did not.
I never mocked on her appearance, and there's plenty of subject matter there, believe me, but I never did it. So I didn't appreciate that. But ultimately, jokes aside, I think that the nuance is irrelevant to the discussion of morality, which is really what we're here to discuss. And so I'd be curious, what is your position then on the morality? Assuming we've got our guys, they're hyper competent, we can get it done. Well, our guys or girls, we don't want to be discriminatory to our women in politics. There's nothing we love more than women getting involved in politics. So what would that position be, I suppose? Because you did mention, too, the anger and frustration. I think that's very real. There's a lot of anger, a lot of frustration, particularly from young men in this country, from young women, too, about how Washington represents them, how they are being represented at all in any form of government. And I think that actually does tie back to the issue of pornography, because like we mentioned with what it does to the reward circuitry, it leaves young men, and some young women too, but particularly young men, feeling despondent, feeling as though they're just restless and angry and they have no ambition or way forward. And so I think, honestly, pornography, if I had to put on my tinfoil hat, is partially why we see so many terrible things happening in our society, because traditionally speaking, the people who would have been impediments to that, young men, are being completely placated and made into these despondent zombies who would rather stay inside and smoke marijuana and watch pornography and play Fortnite, which we'll excuse for the next season. But they would rather do that. They would rather do that than get involved in politics like us, doing cool stuff like us. And so I think that part of that like young male vitality is just being drained away into tissues and keyboards because of the access that they have to this material, which I think is probably causal to at least a certain extent.
Okay, so we're going to go one at a time here. Just starting at the top, I asked the Destiny subreddit for help debunking the bullshit that you spew on your channel.
Never happened.
Which was a lot of factual errors. And if you want to go blow by blow tonight, we can go through some of the claims you've made on your video.
Sure.
I think it'll get a little contentious. I would prefer for us to talk more constructively without ad hominem attacks. This is Brianna Wu that's here talking to you today. I think I have a lot of faults as a person, but being authentic and genuine and trying to reach out to people like you in good faith, even when you personally insult me, is not, that's how I roll. So let's go one at a time. John, it is really complicated politics, and I know you're trying to minimize that. That's probably because you run a YouTube channel, man. You don't raise money, you don't run a 501c3 or a 501c4. You don't work with any of the regulatory stuff. There's a whole host of stuff about how you put together a political coalition, how you make people happy, how you fund it, how you stay in compliance with these issues. It is actually really complicated. And the thing I think that you're really minimizing that's important is if you want to build political coalitions, you have to work with other people. Something I would really criticize my own side for is a sense of utopianism. I think there's a real strain in the Democratic Party right now that we see where we kind of have this real ideal of what we want to go to and this utopia that we want to move towards. And rather than thinking about the slow, boring parts of how we get there, we shoot for the moon and want the maximalist thing. And I think respectfully, you are the mirror image of that. You have this theocratic vision for the country, which is your right as an American under the First Amendment. You have this theocratic vision of the country where the government steps in, says what you can look at, how you can look at it, how you can do all of this. And we can go through your public statements on that. I have a different vision. I think that I think that if we're serious about solving the actual problems that you've correctly delineated, I think we need to look at how much we are apportioning at the federal level for pornography addiction recovery. I think we need to ask ourselves how many specialists in this we're training. Personally, I think with the explosion of the number of men that are dealing with pornography addiction issues, if you want to go to college, get a master's degree and learn how to help people in this, I think the government should pay for it. So, how much more time do I have, Sean? So I'm just going to talk about the moral issue of this a lot. I think something I've seen you do a lot on your channel is you really paint my side of the aisle with a broad brush. I've been married for 15 years. I don't work in porn. I work in public policy. Yeah, I am a feminist, but I'm not a fat feminist that you seem to hate so much. I'm an utterly normal person that works in politics, right? And the reason I'm saying this is when it comes to the morality of this, I am equally concerned with children having access to these kinds of really sexual images. I think you're correct. We've seen some of these studies, it does damage them at a young age. The good news is there are things out there that if you have a Windows computer, there are tools baked into this natively to help you keep your children safe. Exact same thing with the Mac computer. Exact same thing if you're using the Google search engine. So we do have tools that can help parents keep their children away from inappropriate material. The problem is we've done a really poor job educating people on how to set those controls. So I think, as always, a more nuanced strategic policy position that's looking at the problems and solving it objectively is going to do much better than what we call in engineering a boil the ocean strategy.
Thank you, guys. And now we will move on to our first question, which will be for John. You will have 5 minutes to respond, and then Brianna, you'll have 3 minutes, to rebuttal that. In an age where VPNs and encryption can bypass a lot of restrictions on the internet, are you concerned that banning pornography would be hard to enforce and would lead to more invasions of privacy by the government and big tech?
And a lot of my job as somebody who just talks about things on the internet is to cast a wide net. So it is true that, like the libertarians love reminding me, you can never really ban something because it'll create black markets, people can always access it. That's true, but typical libertarianism not taking into account the realities of human nature, there are certain extents to which people will go to access material that they want. So if you could, for example, regulate pornography the same way that you regulate child pornography, or at the very least do something like mandatory ID verification across all 50 states, it would reduce consumption by probably upwards of 50%. Am I going to be there with my cool friends going knocking door to door, raiding people's houses to see if they have a Playboy? No. I am trying to just reduce consumption in a practical way, not very idealistic, not theocratic, but in a practical way. So would people still download VPNs? Sure. Would people still find a way? Probably. But really what I'm concerned about is that just mass consumption, which really has only arisen in our country in the last few years or so because of the rate of proliferation throughout society that we've seen with this issue. I'd also like to respond to a few things that were mentioned. I am a guy who runs a YouTube channel, okay? Guilty as charged. But it is true that there is something to be said about that. I mean, my job is ultimately, not to throw shade on my constituents in the YouTube community, but I'm not a guy who's like doing jelly bean eating challenges or something like that. I am the toy maker. My job is to take young men and wind them up and just set them off in the right direction. And these young men, they go and they work in politics. They go and work for media companies that have much larger reach than myself. And you also mentioned that I don't, have any real knowledge or experience working with the legislature because of the nuances of the issue, which is true to a certain extent. But I did work actually with state legislatures who ended up banning this at the state level in terms of the ID verification. So that is true. And, there is a trend, which I only say this because it was brought up, where we can do these events at any point in the country, just 24, 48 hours notice. We had guys driving 4 hours to come see this tonight. We have, this consistent ability to get rooms full of 100, 200 young guys with very little notice. And so it's not nothing, but that is something in terms of the message and the political power that you can have with a YouTube channel. And I also think it's worth mentioning, the $20 billion to start a conversation about it. We just spent like hundreds of billions of dollars in Ukraine, Israel, all these other foreign conflicts. $20 billion is pennies to the United States government. And with what I believe to be the extremity and monstrosity that is this issue, I think it would definitely be worth it. And I'm trying to kind of avoid the more bureaucratic argument with, oh, it's just very nuanced. Like, I feel almost bad. Like, I am saying, children probably should not watch pornography. And you're like, so true, but it's just so complicated, the way to get them to stop doing that. And so I would wonder, like, if we could say, do something at the state level to mandate ID verification, would that be something that you would support? I mean, red states were able to do that. It was done pretty quickly. We have significant majorities in both chambers of state Congress. You could literally just wake up and do that if they had the willpower to do so, but they largely don't, probably because they're watching porn. And I also think it's true. You seem to allude as well to the, parents need to just be more involved in their kids' lives. That is definitely true. If every parent was a great parent, they would install these softwares and children would not be watching this material. But I honestly think that the way it exists now in society, with how it is literally marketed to children on social media, the way that their friends are watching it, there's an ecosystem that exists that honestly is beyond the scope of what a good parent can do. I mean, if you're a parent and you're trying to prevent your child from watching this, you have to have a level of involvement that is multiple times greater than, say in the 1970s or something, where like, oh, Johnny's outside and he's got a crumpled up picture of a boob on a Polaroid and something like that. It's like a completely different environment. So in an ideal world, parents would be watching their kids and monitoring this, but I'm not willing to take the risk of maybe parents aren't actually doing their job completely competently, and that's going to have widespread effects on the ecosystem of young people in this country as a whole, who with the messed up brains will then become the older people and so on and so forth.
So I just want to take one point you just made in really good faith. I don't think it's that parents are bad or they don't care when it comes to doing this stuff. I think the programs are actually relatively difficult to set up. In prepping for this debate, I did it on iOS, I did it with Google, I did it with Microsoft. It actually took a high degree of technical knowledge. I'm a software engineer. I had to play around settings for a really long time. The good news is, I don't usually look at porn, John, but I did try to with my parental controls on, and these are actually pretty good tools overall. So I think this is one of the big problems in the tech industry, that we create really, really good ways to solve problems, but they're made by engineers, and we're just the worst people at making things that people understand how to actually use. So I don't know if, this is where it really gets into my belief that the United States has really forfeited our role in the world in shaping technology legislation. If you look with the GDPR in Europe, they are actually taking a much more aggressive role in doing things like, the kind of chargers you can use, what the privacy standards are. I urge you to actually look at the people in Washington, D.C. They're actually making your technology policy here in the United States. Like, one is a home economics major that came from my home state of Mississippi. They're completely unqualified. So it pains me to say this, but I actually don't believe that our Congress, even with the best of intentions, could write a bill that could ban pornography if that was a good idea, which I don't think it is. If you look at the actual jurisprudence and the legal issues around these ID check verifications, study after study shows these do not work. So I think the answer truly is making these tools easier for parents to use and making them more aware of it.
We'll have your first question today, Brianna.
Sure.
You have 5 minutes for this to respond, and John will have 3 minutes to rebuttal. Some people have argued that easy access pornography has led to porn addiction. Yeah. Notably, some people like Billie Eilish have said that porn addiction destroyed her brain, created unrealistic expectations for sex, killed her sexual appetite, and even allowed for some physical and sexual abuse. Do you believe that there are some restrictions on pornography that should be in place in order to prevent any potential addiction or other negative effects to it?
I don't think there are restrictions that should be put in place. Pornography addiction is very clearly a real thing, and I think John is completely correct that it is getting worse for this generation, just objectively. Go look at this. Now, I'm not as confident about the studies I was able to find, as he says on his YouTube channel. The most strong evidence I was able to find of this was for a self-report of users with 2,075 people actually self-reporting whether they thought they had a problem. 11% men and 3% of women said they thought that they had a problem with pornography addiction somewhat. So even if that doesn't actually rise to the level of needing clinical treatment, I think all of us can agree, like if 11% of people are feeling that way, that's something we need to be thinking about as a society. And with this, I try not to talk too much personally, but I do want to share a story. I recently celebrated 20 years of sobriety. When I was a young congressional staffer, I found myself with a polyaddiction disorder. I was literally doing any drug I could get my hand on. I went to the PEP program in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, which is the same program Tiger Woods went to for his sex addiction problem. And they got me clean 20 years ago. It gave me some really, really helpful tools for the rest of my career. I've struggled with addiction. I've beaten addiction. 20 years of sobriety is a huge, huge accomplishment. And the way that you beat addiction is you have structure in your life, you have awareness of what your triggers are, and something I actually think conservatives are really smart to advocate, something I wish we'd do more on the left, which is advocating responsibility. If you're struggling with addiction, the only thing that's going to get you sober is accountability, which is why the whole function of rehab is to do that. What makes this more difficult is if you start looking at pornography addiction treatment, do you know that inpatient live at the hospital treatment for that costs $38,000 a month? That's just simply not tenable. And it's unclear from everything I've seen if insurance is even going to cover it, which is why I believe so many people are turning to these YouTube videos. So I think the problem of pornography addiction is serious. I agree with John that it's growing. I just don't think the answer is to ban it. I think we need a national strategy on addiction, and last point, which is why I was so glad that President Biden has sought out a massive increase in addiction funding at the federal level to help people with all kinds of addictions.
John, you have 3 minutes to respond.
I can tell that you used to work on the Hill. The solution is we need to get everyone together and talk about it and have more funding for this bureaucracy and do this and X, Y, Z. I don't think it's that complicated. For example, like we mentioned, you could literally just ban it. It's banned. We regulate child pornography. Why could we not just mirror the same with pornography? Certainly that would work as well as it does with child pornography. Of course, you can still access that type of material, but it's much harder to do, and there are penalties for doing so, which I was interviewed earlier about this. I wouldn't want to, penalize people who are viewing it, because I do ultimately, as I'm sure you may sympathize with, view them to be victims. But there is something to be said about how effective our sort of security apparatus can be at regulating content if we decide that it's a threat to the national interest, which I think it is. And also, even in the case of just mandating the ID verification, Pornhub literally rage quit. They were like, okay, screw you, Arkansas, and then they're not going to allow for their content to be in Arkansas anymore. So it can work either directly or indirectly. And I think that we just keep returning to this issue of, it's nuanced and complicated. But then you also said in the beginning of your answer that ultimately you don't even want to ban it. And I don't think that measuring people's self-perceived, well, maybe I have an addiction, maybe I don't believe they're reliable narrators. I certainly have known a few alcoholics who definitely do not think they have a problem. They're not reliable narrators because their lives have been compromised, and their brains and their minds and their souls have been compromised by the thing to which they are addicted. And so I think looking at their behavior is much more important. So if 50% of young men are viewing pornography every day, it's like, dude, I can stop anytime I want. Okay, well then do it. No, I don't want to. It's like, okay, well you might be addicted and also experiencing the symptoms of addiction. So I think it is very real, and you've got this situation where their brain is rewired to disregard things that impede its access to that hit of dopamine. And so if you ask them perhaps in a clear mind, are you addicted? They'll just be like, no. And also I think it may not even occur to people to have the thought that there are problems with this, because if you're a guy, it's very difficult to look at a naked woman and be like, I disagree with this. And so it's probably something to the effect of, it's not as obvious as something like doing crack or binge drinking. It's a much more pernicious type of addiction, I think. So I'd certainly be open to a national conversation, but what I fear is that it's a sort of pivot, let's talk about it, let's find out how we can regulate this. But then I think, and you might even agree with this, that if we were to do that, if Joe Biden came out, based Catholic Joe Biden, and said we're going to have a conversation about pornography at the national level, the left would probably be upset about that and say it's stigmatizing sex work and it's ultimately negative and pornography is good because ma-pee-pee, something like that. And so I think it's sort of like a disingenuous kind of maneuver. So why don't you want to just ban it? Why don't you want to just regulate it the same way that we regulate child pornography?
Do I have a chance to rebut this?
You can do that after the question for him if you want to, and we can also address in the Q&A section if you want. So John, your next question is that some people have argued that banning pornography would drive a lot of people to do sex work underground, resulting in more crime and STDs. How can you be sure that banning pornography wouldn't create more problems?
I don't think that's true. I think that the problem we have is that it has become, because of the internet, so democratized that the sort of accessibility that has become easy upon becoming no longer easy would dissuade people. For example, the art hoe who drops out to start doing OnlyFans, is she really going to try to get involved with some network or something if all of a sudden that's not possible, some underground network? I find that unlikely. I think that now where it's so simple and so glamorized, this idea of like women producing pornography of themselves or what have you, I think if that went away and that monetary incentive to either produce it yourself or to get involved with it or to produce it of other people, if that largely dried up, I don't think people would really go out of their way to do it the way that they may with something like abortion or something like what have you. So I'm not really so worried about that, the sort of underground black market. I think that we could largely account for that. Again, you've got material which is already regulated at a level that is harmful to people, directly exploits people. Pornography is the same, except the age is just different. Obviously, these are not the same sort of exploitation. There's something obviously worse about children, but in terms of how it's affecting people, the societal impact as a whole, the types of pornography that men are watching nowadays, I mean, you look at the most popular categories, it's incest, you've got like furries, all sorts of bizarre stuff that would not occur naturally. I'm not really worried about what would happen if that goes away. Like all of a sudden you're still going to see, a bunch of furries, a bunch of hentai advocates, what have you. I'm not going to tell that story. How much time do I have? Oh, I will tell that story. Last night, I was at the hotel bar, and this lady asked me, what I'm in town for, because I had my Detroit hat on, and I was like, well, I'm debating pornography, and she was drunk at the hotel bar. She was what do they call those now? The high calorie. She was a high calorie woman, and she was yelling at me at the hotel bar. I was trying to have my hotel bar burger, and she was yelling at me about how she's bisexual, and she loves animated porn and her IMVU account. And so I look at that person and I'm like, am I gonna lose sleep if all of a sudden your ability to access that goes away? It's like, no, that's like my villain origin story actually, is you embarrassed me at the hotel bar, and so now I am going to take away your one source of pleasure with my cool friends. Anyways, so yeah, I'm ultimately not that worried about it. Because if we can reduce the access by 50%, 60%, it's really that's achieving the win condition enough to where I'm going to be happy with it. It's not like we're trying to, build a bridge that can reduce traffic by 30 minutes and then we only reduce it by 5 minutes. It's like, if we can do something that's going to get young men off of this, make the issue more stigmatized, dissuade people from viewing it, from distributing it, from creating it, I think that's ultimately positive, regardless of whether people are so addicted that they choose to download VPNs and risk, whatever VPN issues are existent with that. So, yeah.
All right. Brianna, you have 3 minutes to respond to that.
Fantastic. I'll address this one point super quickly, where I can't even touch the hentai thing. I'm sorry. I do want to go back and talk about some of the other points I was talking about, so I'll leave that one alone. John, one of the things I think, this is where I think you don't understand, you're trading one bureaucracy for another, because I don't think you understand. I don't think you've thought through how this would actually work. Let me give you a really concrete example. So we spent $20 billion for one of our main agencies on basically drug control, basically helping people with addiction. I started asking how much of that $20 billion is actually going to people that are struggling with addiction. And no offense to my friend in the back that works in law enforcement, but only $2.43 of that was actually going towards addiction treatment, research, things like that. The rest of it was going to actually prosecuting you. And the thing I think you haven't thought through is, if you're spending money directly towards rehab programs, building standards, that's something that makes sense to me. Even making get halfway houses where people can live with accountability like they do with drug addiction. That makes sense to me. You are talking about creating a police state. So you can do this two ways. You can do it with civil penalties or you can do it with criminal penalties. I want all of y'all to think about our failed war on drugs. Now, I can tell you, as someone with 20 years of sobriety, I'm not that kind of liberal that's going to tell you to go out there and do heroin. It's not going to be a big deal. That's not my message. But I do think all of us can agree that we spent too much money putting people in jail and not enough treating people that have addiction issues, which is why drug courts are so fantastically successful. If you start thinking through this, you're going to have to work through the jurisprudence in every single one of these states. Those court cases are going to throw it into chaos. You're going to have to start creating new government bureaucracies, not just at the federal level, but every single state in the country for compliance. Every single tech company is going to have to go out there and create a compliance office to deal with this the same way that we did with GDPR. There are a bunch of young computer science people in the back that I was talking to before this started. Just wait until you graduate and you see how Europe's GDPR law affects how you have to run your containerized data. It's not going to be fun. So every single time you add on this issue, you are trading a bureaucracy for another. And I think there's a very realistic chance this could end up with a lot of people thrown in prison. That's not the America I want to live in. I do think this is a free speech issue.
All right. We will now have the final question, which will be for Brianna. You have 5 minutes, and John will have 3 minutes to respond, and then we'll move on to the Q&A. Some feminists have argued that the production of pornography is abusive to women, even with all the regulations that are on it right now. What do you say to feminists who would argue that banning pornography would save women from being harmed and abused by the porn industry?
Yeah, I think I'm not one of them. I am a sex-positive feminist. I personally believe that you can't have women's liberation without sexual liberation. At the same time, I do think this is a reasonable argument, and I think it's something that needs an answer. Yeah, I have a really good friend of mine, and she's a legend in advertising, and she's actually, she's doing a startup right now to try to create pornography that is more loving, is more female-centric, right? Because she thinks that a lot of this product is just, a lot of it can be rape fantasies and things like that. So I am certainly open to that argument, and I understand where they're coming from. It's one of these leftist issues that's ultimately at an academic symposium. No offense to the many faculty people that may be in the audience tonight, but I think all the students, once you graduate, you're going to find out it's a little bit more complicated than your professors may be telling you it is. So the feminist argument, I understand it, but ultimately this is a free speech issue. You know, the price of free speech in a society like America is we have to deal with a lot of things we find personally distasteful. For me, because I'm a national security geek, one thing I'm really wrestling right now is information warfare. You know, Russia and China, they don't hold our same ideals when it comes to freedom of speech and your ability to criticize the government. They are abusing the fact that we do believe that in America right now to flood Twitter and YouTube and Mastodon and every single social media site out there with a lot of fake accounts to gin up outrage and exacerbate divisions. I don't like that. But it is, I don't see how we could be America if we just threw all that away. So that would be my answer.
Okay, John, you have 3 minutes to respond to that.
I am definitely sympathetic to the arguments from our lovely young women, but I tend to focus more on the arguments that are affecting young men, more so because I view young men as the political force in the country, and I think that a lot of the complaints from women, while valid, are ultimately just, I don't like this, I don't like that. And it's like, okay, like you've got little Timmy over here whose brain is being rewired, and you're like, well, she's naked, I don't like that. And it's like, it's deeper, okay? We got more problems here to focus on than just it's degrading to women. So I'm sympathetic, I like those arguments, but I don't think that's where the core of the issue is. And I think that still, to respond to that, it's clearly possible to regulate. We regulate a lot of media in this country, particularly child pornography. Other countries regulate this type of material, and it can still be accessed, but not as easily as we have. And I mean, again, you have a situation where any person with a smartphone, children, can just pull this up on their phone at any time, and we're being told, well, to actually combat this issue is very complicated and would require a lot of money and bureaucracy and swiping things out. And it's like, okay, we're consulting this very sort of intimidating scenario that's trying to like cloud from the core of the issue, which is like, should we do this or should we not? We do a lot of things. We spend a lot of money, a lot of it's wasted, but we still at least try. And I still think that this country, when it puts its mind to it, is capable of doing things. And so why would we not do this? I mean, what else would we do instead? And also, in terms of creating a police state, I think that's absolutely unnecessary. There's not going to be, like we said, some scenario where we're going door knocking, raiding people's houses, looking for lewd material. If we can shut down the online and digital infrastructure to access this material at any point, like we have now, like we've done with other material, that would pretty much do what we needed to do and achieve the win condition. And in terms of people being thrown into prison, okay, like bye. Yeah, like I mean, if you're gonna, I don't want people who are viewing it to be thrown in prison, but if you are distributing it and manufacturing it and contributing to what is societal illness, why would you not go to prison? Why would you not be punished for that? And I think ultimately in your response, you address the core of it, which is it's a free speech issue. I just don't think that's true. I think legally it might be classified that way, but ultimately it's a moral issue. I mean, you know, to call it a free speech issue, it's like I'm looking at a T.S. Eliot novel and I'm looking at two people having sex on my computer. I'm like, wow, this is literally the same thing. Like, no, it's obviously not. It serves society in different ways. And of course, there are different precedents that exist on obscene material. We could ban this at the state level if we wanted to. Some states have worked towards that already. But the idea that there's some sort of merit to it, the same way there would be with us having this conversation tonight, or someone publishing a novel that's critical of the government and sort of alluding to this idea that, well, if we ban one, it's a slippery slope and we might ban the others. I just don't think that's true. And again, the founding fathers, like I mentioned, that constructed our legal framework rooted in the English common law tradition, if they heard us tonight saying that they did all of this so that we could watch this type of material whenever we want and it's all about free speech, they would have been appalled and they probably would have had us hanged. And so I don't think that's a genuine argument. And I think also legal precedent, what does that even mean? Our court exists to interpret the Constitution. Roe v. Wade, legal precedent, not anymore. W us. So yeah.
All right, thank you guys. Let's give a round of applause for our debaters for Luke's Q&A.
I had a question for Mr. Doyle. As a Catholic, who is your patron saint, and do you have any special devotions to other saints?
I believe, if I recall, St. Francis of Assisi. And you got to remember, this was like 2014. This was before I was truly Catholic. This was like, okay, Mom, I'll go to catechism every Monday. But in turn, don't laugh at me, all right? We've all been there. He's literally me. So true. I don't know. Maybe St. Elizabeth Ann. That's where I go to. Well, I shouldn't dox myself, but I suppose, yeah. If I had to compile a list, I suppose I should, but none immediately come to mind.
What's up, John? I'm actually giving an anti-porn speech on Wednesday for my speech class. Funny enough. Do you have any of your sources on the internet anywhere that I could find them, or like?
Yeah, you know, I've got a document that a very bright young man, I will not be able to pronounce his name, I think it's Chet Ayanu, you know, Chetanu? We love Chetanu. He constructed a wonderful note document thing from that video with all the sources there. So if you send me an email, I can send you that. And also, too, you guys are so lazy. Every time I put a little blip, all the sources are there. You Google it, it comes right up. You guys are lazy. You want the work done for you. Can you send me a document with all of it? Do you know how long it took me to drag all those there? And you can't carry the same cross? Yeah, I'll send it to you.
And you ever go to Latin Mass? You a Latin Mass Catholic, or?
Yeah, I appreciate, you know, actually we did one of these in Georgia a month or so ago. And this dad told me that I had to get up at like 6 a.m. so that he could take me to his parish and attend that service. And it was one of those things where it's like, I don't want to do this. I'm trying to think of an excuse. But I was like, when a man says he's bringing you to his parish, if you say no, that makes you like, you know, you should, yeah. So I went, and it was wonderful. That was, I think, the second or third that I'd been to. I should go down in DFW. I know the parish that everyone says is the best one, but it's kind of far away. And I'll be honest, sometimes on Sunday morning, it's tough to make that drive. So I typically attend Novus Ordo.
Hi, Brianna. So recently, MindGeek had removed 10 million videos, including child pornography, from Pornhub and their sister sites, despite publicly claiming that there was only 138 videos on there. And private investigations, like shown in Netflix's Money Shot, has shown there is still double to triple the amount of this content on their sites. So I would like to ask, how would anything other than a ban, such as the rehab or the loving porn that you mentioned tonight, do anything to solve this issue in and of itself?
So I think this is a very salient issue. Thank you for asking this. So I'm not completely up to date on all the porn companies. Is MindGeek, they're the ones that bought this particular site? They're the parent company?
They're the owners of Pornhub, RedTube, and I believe X-Hamster.
So Pornhub, as I recall, is that the one where anyone can upload stuff, and they had that whole problem with deep fakes and people uploading other people's materials? Anyone can upload to that, correct?
I believe all three have the ability for anybody to be able to upload.
So, John, I would hope you'd be able to join me in this. I think this particular model is terrible for 1,000 reasons. One of the things that big tech is doing, and this has all kinds of secondary effects for social media, for reporting scams on GoFundMe, is they've actually outsourced. They want to scale their ability to put out videos so quickly that they've just outsourced all the reporting and telling bad content over to you. So it's utterly unsurprising under this model that a ton of garbage like that is coming through. I think maybe the answer should be civil penalties for a place like their parent company, MindGeek, if they are hosting this garbage. Let's make it more expensive until it makes more sense for them to do compliance and be in follow the law than to let this garbage on there.
I would like to say just one last thing. They
Sure.
do already require either a individual ID verification or a company verification for confirming age, and these companies do still bypass that.
Wow. Well, I think that shows the process isn't working. So let's make it a lot more expensive to F up like that.
Hello, thank you guys both for being here. My question is for Brianna. So there are no more studies that are being done on men and their effects of watching pornography. And this is because, according to the ethics board for the American Psychological Association, once the results of a study have been shown to have extremely detrimental effects and there's no way to reverse them, those studies are no longer allowed to continue. It has been proven that men who watch pornography objectify women. They do not, the areas of the brain that light up don't register them as human. And also over time, because of dopamine, the dopamine deficit, men watch increasingly violent forms of pornography, and this bleeds out into our everyday life. I think that John said that the issue affecting women was kind of trifling compared to men. I would argue that it is the absolute opposite.
Yeah.
When we have a society where women are being exploited and harmed, and where anecdotally girls getting into relationships are being asked to do increasingly degrading and harmful things, I would ask, how, as a feminist, are we able to justify this kind of behavior? It's more than an academic issue, but it's rather an issue that affects the safety of women and girls.
Yeah, I hear you. Thank you for that great question. Please send me those studies after this panel. I would love to look at that. One of the problems I've found is I'm not very confident in the studies I have seen. I've seen some good meta-analyses, but this is a very difficult thing to research. I want to piggyback off something you said, which is I do think what's happening to girls is really, really not discussed enough. I want to share with everyone out there an issue I'm increasingly running into professionally. There was a stat that came out recently about the number of young women that are doing OnlyFans content. And I want to be clear, I'm a sex-positive feminist. If you want to make that choice, you can do it. But that doesn't mean I think it's a good choice necessarily. I've talked to so many young women that want to work in politics now for a congressional staffer. They want to go work for Microsoft or Apple. And they've got this in their past. And just to be frank with you, it's going to F up their entire career, right? And I've been asking myself, what are the reasons that so many more women are doing OnlyFans nowadays? I think part of it is economic, but I also think part of it's got to be Instagram. Like we've seen study after study of what Instagram is doing to young women and making them, sexualize themselves. And I do think a lot of young women are like feeling this power from participating with that. I don't think that's good for America. I don't think it's good for society. And I think we need to be giving those women other ways to get self-esteem, in my view. I hope that answers your question.
Can I respond to that as well? I would just like to clarify that with the things I say on YouTube.com, I am trying to sell the points to a predominantly male audience. And, I don't want to be the guy that's like, guys, Coach is right. We have to be nice to women and respect them, because then these guys aren't going to show up. They're going to be like, okay, simp, and then they're not going to think I'm cool. So I do have to kind of curate it to a predominantly male audience. But I will also clarify, nobody has more respect for women than me, than the guys in this audience. And to prove that, after this event, we're going to MindGeek HQ, and we're going to make America great again. These people have names and addresses, and we're going to go get them. So rest assured, the problem will be solved. We'll take care of it. That's for legal reasons, by the way. That was a complete joke. I disavow all of that.
You got it. Good evening, good evening, both of you. Hope you've enjoyed your stay in South Carolina, John. My question is for you. And you mentioned earlier kind of the effect that pornography has on the spiritual realm of men in particular. And I think that's a very important issue, because it seems that in our modern day, a lot of churches, a lot of mainline denomination churches, the pastors don't want to talk about, pornography in church. They don't want to talk about issues affecting men more broadly. They don't want to talk about this stuff. And I think that kind of leads to a lot of men not knowing where to turn, and we turned it to your content, which I love. It's great stuff, but we should be able to turn to our pastors and our churches, or at least show up at church and hear it sermonized if it's such a major crisis. So I guess my question is, why is it the case that we don't hear that? And how can we get pastors and churches talking about these issues again, engaging men and engaging these problems?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think in the sort of shorter timeline, you're probably just going to have to shop for a better parish. I remember when we moved down, my buddy and I, to DFW, and we were sort of looking around, we had gone to reconciliation at one parish, and the priest, we were discussing sins of a more lustful nature, and he was just sort of like, yeah, I mean, that happens, and, well, sure, but we might need a little bit more insight and sort of spiritual guidance and mentorship if we're going to be having those kinds of conversations. So yes, in the short term, it does certainly have to be probably a more sort of hands-on approach from you or for whomever in picking a parish that's better. But in the long term, I think that men just need to have more leadership within the church. I mean, every time I go to Mass, I see mothers and I see their children and I see very few fathers. Sometimes I see them, but largely no. I mean, they'll help organize. You'll have the Knights of Columbus or what have you, but they just want to have a good time, and that's fine. It should be a social, communal environment, but if you're not guiding towards young men towards things that are better and more pure than that type of content, I mean, why are you even trying to build a church community in the first place? So I think it starts by being that guy and just sort of introducing that conversation into the ecosystem, and it's uncomfortable, and it's going to get a lot of lack of eye contact because 80% of you, I don't know about this audience, but national average, who knows about the church, but still, it's uncomfortable, but it ultimately does have to be addressed.
Good evening to all of you. I have two questions, one for each speaker here, and I would like to start off my question with Ms. Wu here. And the beginning question is: do you think that as society progresses, that the pursuit of degrees in, say, college education, I'm talking not tech schools, I'm 4-year colleges specifically, do you think that is a natural trend that is progressing into that's just our society is trending to, or is it just is artificial? Because throughout my life, I've been told, go get a 4-year degree. I want to go pursue a 4-year degree. I then was asked, what did you learn at your 4-year college for 3 semesters? I could not respond with anything. I went to a tech school, and I've learned more in one night than 3 semesters at a 4-year college.
I think it's a real crisis. I don't want your faculty members to feel disrespected, but when I went to the University of Mississippi at first in 1996, I think I paid $3,000 that first semester. The most I ever paid to go to Ole Miss was $6,000 a semester. And it's a very different value proposition for the four-year degree than I think what y'all are facing. I saw one study the other day that, I'm trying to remember these numbers off the top of my head, but I believe it was $38,000 in debt that y'all are being introduced to. I do think that once you're a few more years down the road, you'll see the value of what the education was. It's not necessarily what your teacher said to you. It's going to be the things that you learned between classes, the friends you made, how to get along with people, the initiatives you took. But literally, I've hired 400 people across my career. I've never checked a college degree, ever. It's all about what you can do. So there it is.
And then for Mr. Doyle there, one question. I got to be that guy. Excluding pornography, like, what do you look for in a woman? Boobs or butt?
Why did you ask me this question? Why did you ask? I am up here trying to set a good example, and you asked me a question.
I was excluding pornography because, as we know, men are more attracted towards the physical things. Of
right.
Course, personality does contribute. But come on, man.
The thing is that I'm mad about isn't that you asked me the question, it's that I'm going to have to answer it because there is actually something to be discussed here. So my sort of tinfoil hat on it, if you look at the history of Western civilization, artwork that depicts this sort of obscene content, which maybe we should ban, whatever, there is some artistic merit to it. There's always an emphasis on a woman's breasts as a sort of source of nourishment for young children, things of that nature. And I think that when you look at some more primitive sexual interests, it's much more focused on a woman's butt. And you look at a woman's breasts and it's like, okay, you can feed my children. Nice. It's more, indicative. It's more indicative of a capacity for good genetics. Whereas you look at women's butts, they're all going to the gym now. They're doing squats. And then your stupid monkey brain is like, oh my gosh, she has good genetics. No, she doesn't. She faked that. That's a psyop. She went to the gym for that. That's not real. And you could say the same thing about breast implants, but you can usually but you can usually tell those more than just in the case of the other parts. So ultimately, I don't know. I think the society is trying to, and you look at this with pornography trends as well. A lot of guys are expressing this bizarre interest in sodomy. And you look at the polling on when they began to express those interests, I was like, I don't know, I was shown it on a pornography website. Now all of a sudden I'm interested in that. I think that's completely perverted, completely unnatural. So yeah, I think that, look at the 1990s, for example. What was the big thing we had to do in the 1990s? Bro, I just gotta see a pair of boobs. Now it's completely inverted and our society's crumbling as a result. So there's something to be said there, I think. That is the correct answer, by the way. Yeah.
All right, so Mr. Doyle, I have a question for you. In your opinion, what's the surefire way to ban all porn?
See, I don't even know and sometimes, honestly, I get criticized from the more traditional people about this, but I really would not necessarily be looking to ban all obscene material or all pornography. There's certainly an argument to be made that the way it existed in previous generations with your VHS tapes and your magazines has led to a more normalized depravity throughout society that has caused us to be where we are now, and I'm certainly sympathetic to that. But in terms of we're just trying to kind of stop the leak, I would certainly be more interested in trying to just get it off the internet, and I think that we certainly can do that. Other countries have done it, and their people tend to be a little bit more ambitious and well-adjusted than our people in many cases, so I think it's certainly possible. But in terms of how to go about actually banning all of it, I mean, again, these apparatuses exist in a way that can regulate this sort of content, and there could be monetary incentives for reporting people who are creating these networks of black market distribution. I mean, there's all sorts of things you can do. My intention here tonight is not to sit down and create a policy platform. It was more to normalize my position within the ears of the fine people here. So it certainly can be done. I mean, the government can pretty much do whatever it wants. I mean, we've done things that are far more complicated than this. This is very new. I mean, we went to the moon, or again, convinced people we did. Either of those, very impressive. So I think that we could solve this issue if we really put our minds to it, but people don't because they like it themselves. They ultimately view it as positive because it weakens the spirit of young men, or they just are addicted to it themselves. So, yeah.
Hey, Mr. Doyle, I'm going to reiterate that question because you said absolutely nothing there. How do you plan to legislate this? Because there's every solution you posited in this speech, VPNs, doing the same thing we do as child porn, is absolutely ridiculous. So I just want to re-ask the question.
Why is it ridiculous to regulate it the way we regulate child pornography?
So here's my first thing I'm going to ask you is how would we market things outside of the U.S.? How would we ban those? Would we condemn every single site like we do? Would we condemn every single site?
Sure.
Why
not?
I think because the amount of money that would require, it's absolutely insane. I don't think
it's
realize
insane. I
how
think what is
insane
insane is the idea that you have a constitutional right to masturbate to material as like a 9-year-old that you find on the internet. And I'm being told by you and I'm being told by you that it's just this very complicated policy matter. And how would you go about this? I have yet to hear, should we at least try? And then it's always, well, no, it's a free speech issue. So it's like you're trying to pivot and sort of be disingenuous because ultimately you don't view a problem with this material in itself. It's not like you're one of our guys and you're like, okay, but you know this is going to be a really tough task. It's, well, I don't agree in the first place, but also, how would you even do this? Because politics is so complicated. I acknowledge you can have a VPN, you can get around it, but 90%, 80% in terms of like cumulative reduction in the consumption of this material, I'm sure that's positive or possible. And if it's being circumvented by 10, 20% of the population, that's no skin off my back. I mean, that's them. I am concerned about the general well-being of the population, and I think we absolutely have the infrastructure and intelligence to regulate that responsibly.
Can I respond to that very quickly? And just to think through his example, though. So this is a really good point about how much pornography is made outside the United States. So we're going to have, if we could get enough consent, like public support for your position, which the polls I saw, 80% of Americans don't agree with you, so good luck with that. But now we're talking about creating a government agency to go through and look at every single porn site out there and whitelisting it or blacklisting it, and then opening up for people to civil or criminal liability for that. Like, the more you think through this, it's not just that it's a bad idea and anti-American, it doesn't make sense.
I don't think it's pro-American to have this sort of material. Also, you mentioned the sort of public consensus. I agree. They are hypnotized by this material. So the organized minority must come in and ban it for their well-being. And also, too, if you look at studies that have shown decades of public opinion polling versus what actually translates into public policy, as I'm sure you're well aware, Washington is not actually working for people. What the people want tends to not be what actually happens with issues that maybe you would agree are better for us anyways. So I think it's absolutely possible. And in terms of it being more complicated, creating a whole new bureaucracy, I'm sure the DHS could do it. I'm sure the FCC could do it. Again, I'm not here to come up with policies. Maybe that would be a good video. But the idea, should it be banned in the first place? That's really what we're talking about. And if you agree that the issue is affecting our children severely, it's affecting the collapse of the family structure, people feeling isolated, depressed, if you agree with that, I don't understand why we wouldn't want to at least move in that direction as opposed to create this artificial barrier of so complicated and nuanced. It's probably what they thought about, like creating an interstate highway system too, but we did that. And so I think that it's not actually as nuanced and complicated as it may be being portrayed as.
No, there's just a difference of tactic. I want to tackle the problems directly themselves. You want to address the secondary effect and hope that it addresses the primary effect. It's just a difference of tactic.
I don't think that's true at all.
I think people can make their own assessment.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hey, so my question is for Mrs. Brianna over here. Sure. When is Revolution 62 going to be coming out, and what stage of development is it at currently?
That's a good question. Unfortunately, when I decided to run for office and then started working, running a super PAC, this cycle for the Democratic Party, I'm hoping I can raise $5 to $10 million. So that takes a lot of my time, and that is my focus and not game development. I genuinely hope at one point the United States and our democracy is not on fire, yeah, I can get back to game development because it's a more fun job than running a super PAC. So thank you for asking.
Hello. My question is for Ms. Wu. I found the questions about how harmful pornography can be to women as somewhat unsatisfactory, considering how sex trafficking is so prevalent in pornography and how it's very hard to, like, if you were to regulate it, as you have said, it would be hard to maybe crack down on that specifically. I was also wondering is your idea of how rape has skyrocketed as because of pornography, as several rapists have gone on record as saying the rape fantasies have started with pornography. I also, not certain, but I believe that John Wayne Gacy and Ted Bundy have also started with rape fantasies and pornography.
Sure. So let's take that one at a time. So before the rape, you were talking about sex trafficking, correct? So if there are better steps out there, I would welcome, John, even if you want to email me this after this is over, I started trying to find the link between sex trafficking and the number of people that have been sex trafficked actually working in pornography. It's really hard to find these studies. So I think for the sake of this argument, let's agree it exists. Let's agree it's a really serious problem. From what I was able to see with the FBI funding that we are allocating towards sex trafficking, it is not at the level it needs to be. I personally think that a lot of the attacks we've seen on the FBI over the last few years, these political attacks, have made it really hard for the people that work there to pursue things like sex trafficking. I've worked with the FBI on many occasions. When I ran for office, Russia hacked my email server, and I got to see how much better they were today than they were during Gamergate at fighting like hacking attempts and things like that. It was night and day. So what I would say is rather than trying to attack a secondary effect, let's dedicate more money for law enforcement to go ruthlessly hunt down sex traffickers, throw them in jail, figure out where they're coming into the country and all that stuff. The reason that's more difficult is because of cam girls and because that's such a bigger thing, and they don't have to be in the United States for that anymore. So, that's my answer for that. The last thing you said was talking about rape skyrocketing. It's true that not many rapes are being prosecuted and resulting in criminal convictions. The last number I looked at was only 2%. But this, again, is because of law enforcement. Violent crime overall is actually going down. People don't realize that. So if we're serious about rape, I think we need a national program to actually go through and process rape kits. Right? We do need more police officers that are trained in the special tools that you need to prosecute these cases. That's what I want to do. Thank you.
Am I allowed to ask you two questions? Just keep one. Got it. For Mr. Doyle, asking primarily as a fellow Christian and also as a side note, as a fan of yours, does watching porn fall under more of lust or idolatry, and is it the most spiritually damaging form of either that you can do to yourself?
To the second part, yes. To the first part, I would probably say lust. I would certainly be interested in the argument for idolatry, but yeah, I would probably say lust.
Thank you. For Mrs. Wu, you, during the argument, during the debate, you referred to yourself as a sex-positive feminist. You also many times agreed with John, and I commend you for doing so, on the negative effects of pornography, and then later during the Q&A, you reiterated the negative effects of pornography for women, mostly resulting from porn-addled men seeking the wrong things in relationships. If you then defined sex-positive feminism as supporting the right of women to self-produce pornography, the same pornography that leads to these problems in men and therefore women, how can you be supporting women, or how can you hold that position without holding it at the cost of the mental, physical, and spiritual well-being of men and, by extent, women?
So I want to make sure I understand your question so I can answer it. So you have a contention with the definition of sex-positive feminist because you think that because there are these secondary effects we're talking about that are harmful for women, that it's not possible for sex-positive feminism to exist, or am I misunderstanding your point?
Well, you said explicitly earlier that you support the right of women as a sex-positive feminist to produce, say, OnlyFans content.
Sure.
I don't think you went as far as to recommend it, but you said
I
you said you support the right.
That's right.
So you're supporting the right for the creation of the thing that's causing these problems that we've been talking about.
That's right.
For the duration of the evening.
Yeah.
And I'm not. You could get into, I don't support the problems, but I support this. But how can you, if she's producing porn, a guy's watching it, and it's ruining his life in most cases, that's inseparable. So how can you hold that position without holding it at the expense of men's well-being, and eventually, when they start dating and just seeking sexual gratification, women's well-being?
Sure. So there are two components, and thank you for that question. It's a very thoughtful question. There are two components of this that I think if you look around the world and you look at societies that tend to really clamp down on women's sexual expression, generally speaking, directionally, overall, those societies don't tend to be great places for women to live. It's harder for them to work, harder for them to be treated with dignity, just not great overall. So I think that the Western value of being more okay with sexual expression, I think this is overall a better frame of mind. Doesn't mean I think there are no problems whatsoever, but I think sex-positive feminism is one that makes more sense, but it's completely fair. Many feminists disagree on this. So to the second part of this, I actually don't think, and I'm sorry, John, I don't agree with you on this, I don't think that pornography necessarily ruins men's lives, every single man's life that watches this. If you want to respond to this after I get done, I'd love to hear it. You had one quote that really struck me, where you said there are only two kinds of men, ones that are currently addicted to pornography and ones that will be addicted to pornography. I don't think that's true. I really don't. I think there are probably a lot of people in the audience that have a healthy relationship with this. More directionally, we've seen study after study talking how masturbation is actually good and normal and healthy. These were studies that came out when I was a teenager in the 90s, and they were people talked a lot about that back then. So I don't really agree with that assessment, but if I'm missing something, please let me know. Do you want to respond at all?
Sure. The addiction quote, if I recall correctly,
I've got it right here.
That there are, well, you misquoted it because there's a subcategory in the second category. There are something to the effect of there are two kinds of men. You've got men who are not addicted to pornography, and then men who are addicted to pornography.
Yeah.
And then you've got within that category men who don't realize it and men who do realize it.
Yeah.
So the point there is to say any man who is watching pornography regularly because of the way that it affects his brain will over time become addicted to it in the sense, and that's why we know 80% of men are viewing it at least once a week, 50% are viewing it every day. If we observe their behavior, are we really supposed to say these men aren't addicted, they just have to do it like every day?
Yeah. But don't you think it's like, for me, I'm sure a lot of people after this is over, y'all are gonna go have a drink at a bar. You can do that normally. I just can't go with you. Like, there's something about me where if I start drinking or doing drugs, I can't stop, right? That's me. It's my personal responsibility to be aware of that and not put myself in those situations. I think this is the same with a lot of men, that maybe they don't have that gene or that proclivity towards it.
I think the difference would be that with something like alcohol or cigarettes or any kind of addiction like that, you can make a more conscious choice, whereas when you see pornography or you hear about pornography, it brings back, like a lot of addicts, for example, will say that even just the smell of alcohol triggers them. Mm-hmm. Well, the sight of a woman on TikTok or Instagram or anywhere, I mean, our advertisements, our culture is so just pornographic in general that can be very triggering to men in a way that would be similar to that. And in terms of it being good and healthy, I don't think that's right. I've seen a lot, it can reduce prostate cancer or something, and then we found out that study was garbage data, and then we found out it's like can relieve stress, maybe temporarily, but you look at the baseline levels of stress as measured by the stress hormones of those men, those are actually elevated because of the feelings of depression and anxiety. So it might be natural in the sense that chimpanzees jerk off, but they only do that in captivity, right? And so what does that say about the psyche of men nowadays where they feel like they have to just compulsively masturbate every time they get on their computer?
Yeah. I don't agree, but we'll leave it there.
One question per person. So my question's for both John and Brianna.
Sure.
Brianna, you mentioned earlier that you were sympathetic for girls on Instagram who are sexualized, and this seems to be a problem of just a deeper sickness in our culture. And John, of course, you'd be sympathetic to girls online dressing immodestly, and this goes not just for online, but for anywhere. So what would be a solution to this? It's not necessarily pornography, but it might be pornographic in nature, borderline. So I propose it might be trying to instill the virtue of modesty into our population. If not that, then how?
Do you want to go first?
Sure. I think that what we find is basically throughout history, and this is a take that a lot of people don't like, but the only thing that has been able to cultivate an environment where modesty is considered to be a virtue and it's enforced is basically very strict Christian patriarchal societies. And I think nowadays a lot of the more traditional guys get it wrong because they think that the way that we can get more women to behave modestly is by basically saying like, can you please do it? You'll be like so much more trad if you don't. It's like the reason women dress that way is because a woman's only agency is more or less her sexuality. If I'm a guy and I need something done, I can get it done by pretty much anybody, but only a woman can offer me, unless, I've watched too much porn and then I become a little different. But typically what happens is a woman's only thing that she can really, and so that's why it's the way they dress, the makeup they use. Women are very, they like to go around in public and maybe they'll just be wearing makeup or high heels, and that's still sexual, even if less sexual than a woman who's dressed more provocatively. And so the actual answer to this, if you want women to dress more modestly, you have to start acknowledging the way they're dressed, we'll say. Because what women are doing, 50, 60, 70 years ago is they're saying, well, I'm going to dress modestly, and if you want to see me dressed immodestly, then you're going to have to marry me because that's what they want. Now it's completely inverted, where you have women dressing immodestly, and men are like, can you please dress modestly, please, and I'll marry you if you do. So it's like the gynocracy, the matriarchy, it's completely backwards and inverted. And so in a weird way that's maybe counterintuitive, if you want women to dress modestly again, you have to act like that's what you want, because then they're going to be like, well, no, you can't have it. I'm going to leverage it for commitment, for whatever, marriage. Whereas now it's just completely backwards. So I think it would start by reinstituting a more Christian society, certainly, but with that comes normal male behavior and patriarchy. So I think it is multifaceted and very nuanced of an issue.
So you just said something, and I want to address it respectfully, talking about how you feel like for a lot of these young women, their attractiveness is the main thing. Do you remember when you went on the Whatever podcast and my friend Pixie was there? Do you remember her?
Was Pixie the young lady who left?
No, that was her good friend, Straighterade.
Is Pixie
blonde, really friendly, all that kind of stuff?
I don't.
Sure, no worries. So my friend Pixie, she's gorgeous, she's amazing, but I work with her on a team with Progressive Victory. I actually just hired her. And this is something so many young women are dealing with, and I say this as someone that hires people right and left all the time. I do think a lot of men in society look at someone like Pixie or other attractive young women and only see them for their looks. What I've found over and over is when you hire those people and you give them an opportunity, women overall can bring so much to an organization. There are emotional skills, there's an ability to read a room, there's a sophisticated way to think about problems. The women I know in computer science approach things generally very differently than the men that work in computer science do. And they're some of the strongest team leaders and project managers you're going to find. So I think that's fundamentally a wrong read. Coming back to your comment about Instagram, this is where I would really criticize America's decision to forfeit technology regulation. I forget the woman's name. Do you all remember the Facebook whistleblower? Her name is escaping me right now. She unleashed all this data showing all the studies that Facebook has done behind the scenes about what their product is doing to young girls. It's terrible. It's giving them body dysmorphia, terrible anxiety. It's making them only value themselves for their looks. And this is something I think we could engage with more constructively, that algorithm. We need to be a partner with big tech because this is our information space as a country. And I think it makes sense to work with them as a partner within the limit of free speech.
Can I respond to that briefly?
Yeah.
I would say that on the question of modesty, I mean, even in the workplace, like you mentioned, I don't think it's so much that men are only viewing women as, things to look at, things that are attractive, but I think that women even acknowledge this themselves, perhaps implicitly in their behavior, the way that they dress at the workplace, the use of makeup, simulating the appearance of sexual arousal, and also look at what they post on social media. I mean, I do extend enough agency and belief in women to they can regulate their own content on social media, or even the working women like you're mentioning. You've probably seen this trend, day at the life at the office, and they're walking around, and it's all like a vlog. It's all like, look at me, me, me. So even the content they post when they are working at these tech companies or wherever is very centered upon their appearance themselves, as opposed to a man who would just be like, just did work or something like that. So I think that, and that goes, I mean, guys, it's like, I caught a fish, but it's never just like a selfie, right? Women tend to, if you go through their camera rolls, just thousands and thousands of pictures of themselves. So I think that they seem to acknowledge this even implicitly, that while they are very capable in some circumstances, they also still, I think, leverage their beauty and attractiveness to sort of gain leverage over their male counterparts in the workplace and all throughout the world.
I tell you, you can come into some of the women in tech groups I'm in. You can see we're not talking about vlogging our day. So,
all right, Mr. Doyle. I have a friend who draws not safe for work artwork for commissions, and it's a big source of income for her. Do you believe these independent artists have just as negative an effect on society as the more corporate distributors of pornography?
Literally no, because the scale is much smaller. In principle, sure, and then also the type of, God has blessed you with this talent to create, and you are spitting in his face by creating whatever that is. So I think in principle it is certainly harmful. I would certainly call into question that person's state of mind, state of being. But if I had to direct the, ire of the young boys in one direction, it would certainly be for the larger companies that are distributing content such as that, or even maybe even that kind of content in itself.
How are you? My question's for Brianna. I just want to thank you for being here first and foremost. Many people on the left, as you know, are unfortunately not willing to come have a discussion, so I really appreciate that you were able to come here and express your views and have a seat at the table.
I hope you feel like I've respected you and have answered your questions. Yeah.
No, it's been a very good discussion. But anyways, my question is, you've expressed that you do view pornography consumption as an issue. It's an issue that young men face and young women face. So obviously, if not a ban, an outright ban, which you don't support, how would you be able to get a positive result such as a 60% reduction in male consumption of pornography, if not an outright ban? Because you've talked a lot about rehab and therapy, which is great, but people are only going to seek those if they already have a problem to begin with.
Right. So let me make sure I understand your question. You want to get a 60% reduction?
A significant number that would really impact society in a positive way.
This is engineer brain. How do you know that's the right problem to work on?
Well, I guess if you look at the negative effects that pornography causes, as evidenced by studies, depression, anxiety, which have all gone up as pornography consumption has gone up as well. I guess, my question would be, how would you reduce pornography consumption, since you do acknowledge that it is an issue? So we should reduce it.
John,
right?
You said something in your video I really appreciate as a fellow runner, where you're talking about how a lot of this behavior comes from a listlessness, right, or a lack of purpose. I really believe that humans need purpose to do things, and I think one of the ways America's failed is we've left your generation here's America, and you have no pathway to figure out where to go. You don't have structures. The church, I'm Presbyterian, but the church is less relevant than it was a decade ago. You don't have institutions like the Boy Scouts. That's less relevant. And, in my realm, gaming, I think a lot of young men are being raised in gaming. So this is an ambitious answer to your question. I think we need a generational massive investment in young men to give you communities, to give you friends, and this is a problem. I can't solve this for you. Anything I have to say is not helpful. I need men my age to step the F up and take a mentoring role with this army of listless, directionless young men and help give y'all a path forward. That is It's bigger than just porn. I'm talking about the way our country is ripping itself apart. I'm talking about this economic terror that's out there. We've got to massively invest in you, in my view.
I would say to that I think that the generational issue is certainly present, but ultimately, in terms of who's really being disaffected and disenfranchised, it's young white men, because these are people who are largely capable, largely ambitious, but they're denied opportunities at universities. They're depicted as evil in the media. They're taught in many cases from very young ages that their country, their ancestors are all inherently racist. And so it's not surprising to me at all that they've retreated into areas like gaming, which, you look at gaming as a sphere. Black guys, Hispanic guys, they love video games as much as the next guy, but in terms of the gamer archetype, it tends to be like a white guy or an Asian guy, and I think there's something to be said about that. You've got people in society who tend to be from more ambitious, capable backgrounds, and they're sort of having to retreat as we're paving the way for more diverse and equitable sorts of policies, which are leaving guys in the middle America who perhaps don't have an elite university alumni or alumnus in their family. They're just being completely swept under the rug. I would also say that the institutions like Boy Scouts, the church, all very important, but it is worth mentioning as well that those institutions have become have been destroyed because they have become more liberalized. Boy Scouts started letting in homosexuals, started letting in not boys, and now it's like, okay, well, no one wants to join the Boy Scouts. Like, you have to have male-only spaces because we're stupid. You start letting in women, then all of a sudden it's, dude, is he bothering you? It's like, focus. And so we can't have things like that. But now, because of Title IX, you're not allowed to have male-only spaces. And so, two, the rehabilitation I think is important. When we talk about rehabilitating from pornography, this is where I get more callous. Get a grip, dude. It's not like you're doing heroin and you've got these physical withdrawals. Your dopamine receptors are fried. You do a detox, you'll be back to normal in a few months. Just get a grip, control yourself. You're not going to have these withdrawal symptoms that are so physical you have to go to the hospital. If it's that bad, maybe it's just so over for you in the first place. But it's not as brutal of a process that would require some sort of medical apparatus to take you in and make sure you're not viewing bad content. I don't think that it would need to be that extreme. I think if all of a sudden one day you woke up and you can't just Google this stuff anymore and it would come up, people would be better off for it.
Unfortunately, we will only have 5 minutes left in this venue before we're kicked out, so we have time for one more question, unless we can do rapid fire lightning round, real quick question, real quick answer. Let's see if we can do it.
All right, my question is for Brianna. You talk about how it's going to take time and time to do the ban of porn, but you're also talking if there was going to be a ban, you say how it takes a lot of time and a lot of money to get it in Congress and all that. You mentioned earlier $20 billion, but you're also mentioning getting all these specialists trained and so on and so forth. Wouldn't that also cost probably $20 billion or some crazy amount if you want to provide it to people for free or for cheap? So what's then you spend $20 billion once to ban it, or $20 billion all the time to keep supporting people and keep it open?
I want to spend a lot more than $20 billion on your generation, so I hope that's the answer.
Hey, John. I heard that in your speech you talked about porn as a very toxic thing that basically it rots your brain away, very toxic if you even look at it. But then you also describe it as something that, even with an easily bypassable ban by your own admission, people will just stop watching it. So how do you combine these two sort of ways you've described it as very addictive, but also something that, you put up some very easily bypassable measures and people just, don't want to watch it anymore?
Sure. I think I said it was conceivable that it could be bypassed. I don't think I said it was easy. I mean, certainly if someone wanted to go to the extent of doing whatever you would have to do to bypass it, it's certainly possible. But ultimately, I think that sort of constructing these barriers would reduce the amount of net consumption by a measure that would ultimately achieve the win condition for us. So it's certainly possible to bypass like it is. I mean, you can get drugs still at any major city in the country. But in terms of, should we just have heroin available at the gas station then? It's probably not. So I think that constructing these barriers is ultimately positive, even if it is conceivable that they will be circumvented.
Now, this is from Ms. Wu. So the rise of AA porn now is just coming up, which can completely destroy a woman's impression because you can make these women as perfect as possible. What are we going to do with the women that lost their jobs, who probably didn't go to college, don't have a degree, don't have money to their name besides what they got off OnlyFans or porn or whatever?
It's a good question. question. I personally believe that we need AI regulation, a massive amount of this at a really broad level. One of my favorite congresspeople, Ro Khanna, has put out a fantastic set of policies that he wants to talk about with this. And Joe Biden has put out an executive order saying we need to study the effects of AI before it goes into use, which I think is a way forward. I think you're correct. And I think as far as it being a super stimulant, if you think the stuff we're doing now has effects, I can only imagine we can just type whatever you want into deepfakes or AI or this kind of AI technology and get anything you want. It's going to be scary. You need to have a regulatory role.
Hello, my question is for Brianna. It's a quick two-parter.
Sure.
Do you know what pair bonding is?
Yeah.
So my other part, how can you be okay with pornography as it encourages cheating behavior and just further erodes that monogamy?
Can we show that it does cheating behavior at a statistically high level? Do we know that?
I'm not sure on the studies, but my question to you then, could you say that porn therefore does the converse of that? And
so I've been married for 15 years, and something you learn after being married that long, it doesn't threaten me when my husband finds someone attractive. He didn't give up that part of himself when he got married. And he doesn't take it personally if I find a young man attractive, right? This is just, it's normal, right? I think the difference is it doesn't affect our relationship. If that did affect our relationship, that would be something we would need to talk about.
Unfortunately, we are pressed for time, so I'll have to condense my question a little bit. But Brianna, as a person in public policy, where do you draw the line between federally funded rehabilitation and treatment programs and enabling dangerous and self-destructive behavior?
Can you repeat the second part, please?
Where do you draw the line between federally funded rehabilitation and treatment programs and enabling dangerous and self-destructive behavior?
What is an example of a dangerous and self-destructive behavior?
So, this is a question that could apply more broadly to our justice system at large, but drug use as well. But just in the case of porn, or tonight, the topic of tonight, as we've established, porn can be very self-destructive.
Sure.
So where do you draw the line, just in a general policy sense?
Well, I know my friend John does not believe in the DSM from his comments, but I think what the DSM would tell you is when it rises to a clinical level that is causing a lack of function in the rest of your life, that would be the line for me. When you think it's exactly like drinking, right? If I'm going out and I'm drinking and I can't function, and I'm doing 2 bottles of wine a night and a bottle of Xanax, that's a big problem. If you're doing it a little bit and it's not causing that level of distress, you're probably okay.
Awesome. Let's give a round of applause for all the great questions.